So, a very good morning to you from me. I'm Steve. I'm the vicar of Trendlewood Church. I've had a couple of weeks off duty and it's been good to get my head together again. And thank you to Sam and Michelle for preaching and leading while I was away. We continue our series in Colossians as Ed has introduced. And the next bit of the series is towards the end of chapter 3, verse 18 to the beginning of chapter 4. In this Colossian series, we've been looking pretty much clearly at what I would call an incredibly advanced Christology. Some people would say more advanced even than St. Paul would have had in his own lifetime. So perhaps the work was finished off, edited, written by his followers, disciples and students. Whatever and however you feel about that sort of information, we can be sure that we're reading words that he would have thoroughly agreed with, given that almost the entire letter is about the centrality of Jesus. Sam talked about that a couple of weeks ago, and Michelle talked about the implications that has for how we go about living our lives last week. And I guess if I was to summarise what I'm about to talk about, the title I gave it is Relationally Jesus, Mutual Submission. That's a bit jargony, really. All our human relationships are to be governed by our relationship with Jesus. And in this, Paul lists a number of human relationships from his day and talks about how to bring Jesus into them. We're going to learn as we go through it that we live in a very different culture now to the culture Paul lived in and his followers lived in the first century of the Common Era. We'll notice some clear and obvious differences. And our job is not to take each verse and say that applies to this situation today, but to take the principle from each verse and ask how might we allow that to influence what we do now and how we live together. And I think in each of the different instructions Paul gives about living together, there's a little template, a three-part template. Who is he speaking to? And to which relationship is he speaking? And how are his words to be applied? So who, to whom, and how. So we begin in verse 18 of chapter 3. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Dangerous place for a preacher to feel he has to start his sermon on. It's addressed to wives. It's addressed to the relationship between wives and husbands. And it talks about fitting and appropriate submission. When people get married, they don't come to an agreement. I'll do this for you if you do this for me. They come to a covenant. Both parties say, I'll do this whatever. When we get back to having wedding services in churches again, we'll note that the two promises are made joining hands, and then briefly the couple separate hands in between the promises to indicate, I promise you and you promise me. Two separate promises made at the same time. Which means I feel it's reasonable to ask the question of this verse, how do husband and wife mutually submit one to the other? Then the next one is to husbands, and it's a different sort of expression in verse 19. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. And I looked up that word, that's the word for harsh. And it's also a word that can mean sour or embittered. And I think it's calling husbands, and therefore for us today, husbands and wives, to patience with one another. Liz and I have lived together for many, many years, but over the last 3 months, we've lived in the same house on top of each other all the time. And it's fair to say that we haven't always communicated perfectly, and we haven't always found it easy to be patient with each other. Particularly, I think she might have found it difficult to be patient with me because I'm quite infuriating to live with, and she's done well to do it for so long. The feature of this relationship is to love without harshness. How do you take embitterment, sourness, harshness out of a loving relationship? Well, it's difficult, and those of you who have had to work at that will know that it needs some work. This passage in my Bible, following a passage called Rules for Holy Living, is called Rules for Christian Households. And I just think that some of those subheadings are occasionally difficult for us. They're not part of what I would call the Word of the Lord. They're the sub-editor's work at the New International Version of the Bible Society who put it together, and as a result, it might suggest that what we're about to read are rules for all time, never to be disposed of, whereas I believe they're guidance to a particular situation at one time, which we need to apply to our time. So those two verses taken together invite husbands and wives who are Christians and in the Lord to work out together how not to embitter each other, how to be patient with each other, and how to submit one to the other. If you want to know more about that, then go on one of Ian and Helen's marriage refreshment courses. But all I can say is it takes a lifetime of communication and work, and you'll never be finished. Third group of people spoken to: children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Who? Children. Which relationship? With parents. What to do? Obey. Now again, that's something that needs to be teased out as children grow up and become more and more independent. I've just been watching a couple of blackbirds on my lawn this morning, and clearly the blackbirds in my garden have had 2 broods, and the second brood has just fledged. So there's a very, very tiny and immature blackbird chick still being fed by a mother on the lawn, and there is a blackbird chick that is developing into a male as its colour changes and is maybe 2 months old. And the older one keeps coming along to the mother, feeding the little one, and the mother keeps chasing it away, saying, "Go away, be independent, find your own food." Children obviously need from time to time to know that because I say so is important. It's awkward if you find yourself saying that, but there are matters of obedience where children will not understand why running into a busy road isn't a good idea, and yet they must obey you when you tell them not to run into a busy road. They will learn how to cross the road for themselves as time goes on. Children, obey your parents, obey them relationally as in the Lord, and understand that your parents want the best for you. The next bit, verse 21, is addressed to fathers, probably because culturally in those days it was considered that fathers were clearly the head of the household, and I want to take a 21st century liberty and say, fathers and mothers, do not embitter your children or they will become discouraged. Fathers and mothers need to work out with their children how to allow more and more independence. I was talking to a clergy colleague this week who has 2 sons aged 22 and 20 who've come back to live with him during the lock-in, and one is studying law, and he decided that the only possible way to arrange for his son to make more of a contribution to the household over the time that he was staying back with his parents was to come up with a legal agreement that both people signed. And so this guy produced a little contract for behaviour whilst within the house, and he was given it back with 27 amendments, 4 subclauses and 5 references to case law. I think there's a sort of dangerous thing going on there. As you allow your children independence and to study something, they become way smarter than you, and you have to work out how to do that. Both my kids are now way smarter than me, and I have to listen to them and learn from them more than they me. And in the whole process, from time to time, I'm sure I have embittered them, but I haven't meant to, and I've always tried to apologise. So, husbands, wives, children, parents, then we get the awkward one as long as we fail to do the cultural jump. But if we do the cultural jump, maybe not the awkward one. This says, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything. We now have an entirely different view on slavery. It's very contemporary to talk about modern slavery, to talk about the memory of slavery, to talk about the ornaments of slavery, and that's been going on in the media, as you know. Galatians 3:28 reminds us that we're all one in Christ Jesus, neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. And the amazing thing about this passage is that this is addressed to a church, and therefore it is addressed to Christians. And if it's addressed to Christians, therefore it's addressed to Christian slaves. This means that Galatians 3:28 has happened, and slaves have been able to respond to Christ as free people have. It doesn't make slavery right. It doesn't have anything, in fact, to say about the rightness or wrongness of slavery. It's just an assumption of the writer then that there is an appropriate relational behaviour in the Lord, even for a Christian slave. That's shocking, and we've moved on from that. Many people preaching on this passage would move on to the way people work with their employees, and that's quite right. We need to understand that our employers with a contract of employment can ask us to do things, and we need to do it. The interesting thing here is that this seems to be about an attitude. Sometimes people have an attitude to employment that says, I'll do what I can get away with. But here, Paul is suggesting that you are judged by your heavenly Father on how you behave, not when your employer is looking at you, but when your employer is not paying attention. And finally, in chapter 4 and verse 1, and it's a bad chapter break because verse 1 of chapter 4 clearly fits in the section, Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. Provide your slaves with what is right and fair. And the summary comes just before that, so that verse is slightly in the wrong place. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for people, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It's the Lord Christ you're serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for his wrong or her wrong, and that's eventually, not now. And there is no favouritism. Friends, this is an incredibly challenging passage to take away with us as we try and work out how to do our relationships well and better. It warrants discussion, it warrants prayer, and it warrants our time and our thought. Thank you for listening to me as I started things off.